I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Isakovich, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. So, Nir, why did we do this?
Well, we have been talking about tech for many years now, and we don't agree about anything. And you're super optimistic, and I'm not. And we have a ton of fun with it, and it makes us think about it for a long time later. So I think we wanted to share the wealth.
Your background doesn't, you had been working mostly on war and military topics as a philosopher before we started our collaboration. So, what attracted you to the technology topics?
Well, yeah, I have been working mainly about war and the psychology of war and the ethics of war. And that started getting a little too dark. And I thought to myself, where could I bring my dark impulses but experience less of the darkness? And to be serious, when I was hired at UMass to start the Applied Ethics Center, which was in 2017, the conversation about AI was not quite where it is now, obviously, and generative AI was, at least for the larger public, not on the horizon. But I thought it would be very cool to learn something new. As I started learning something new, I became pretty suspicious about the hyper optimistic mindset. Another thing that I thought was really weird and kind of cool is that in the context of these emerging technologies, some of your more conservative impulses can actually turn out to be progressive, where in other areas of life, your conservative impulses just turn out to be conservative. So I know there's more than one way to be progressive about tech, and you'll tell us about that, but that's some of how I got interested.
Well, that's an interesting segue because my history starts back when I was doing bioethics as a graduate student at Chicago and began to realize that I did not share the broadly Luddite sympathies of most bioethicists who we joked that you only needed one word to be a bioethicist, and that word was no, because that's what you're going to say to everything. And I started to carve out a position as more of a techno optimist back then, and then got involved with transhumanism. And then out of that, we started the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which I run. And I landed at UMass Boston in 20, what was it, 2016. And we met shortly after that. And around the same time, I had received a large philanthropic donation to start working on artificial intelligence and human enhancement topics through the IET. My day job at UMass Boston is as an administrator, associate provost, but it's just been really fortuitous that we've been able to establish this collaboration because the big half of my brain that's always occupied by these technology topics, we've been able to satisfy that part by our collaboration. And we've been working together since then on putting together postdocs. So we just did a 2-year postdoc on the AI and the future of work. We had hired a postdoc, Alex Stubbs, who worked on that topic. And the paper that we're going to talk about today, Automating Therapy, is more or less a product of those collaborations. And our new postdoc, who you'll be hearing more about in the future, Cody, is working on the brain-computer interface topics, and we'll be talking about those more, I assume, as well. But yes, my a lot of my life has been for the last 30 years about trying to parse the politics of technology, ethics, and policy in a way that satisfies both my politically progressive orientation and my techno optimism. And as you point out, many people who are politically progressive are deeply techno suspicious. So, not that there's techno suspicion all over the place, but in general, progressives tend to be more technophobic than I think most. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's I think that's absolutely the case. So should we dive into our convo? What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it. So with this white paper, we've published a couple white papers now about the use of artificial intelligence in higher ed. And what was the first white paper?
Uh Technology and oh, about the metaverse. Okay.
Metaverse. Yes, we forgot about it as quickly as the country forgot about the metaverse. But I think the metaverse is still coming back. But we might get back to talking about the metaverse at some point.
Metaverse who? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a nice waste of time, but that's what academics do, so no,
And
no
then
worries.
we addressed important topics, even if the metaverse isn't coming. But this
Yeah.
paper came out of the set of questions about the nature of humans' relationships with chatbots, especially as the chatbots were cooking with full steam in the last couple of years. And we chose the topic of psychotherapy as one place where this could be interrogated. So the paper, The Ethics of Automating Therapy, is available from ResearchGate and philosophy papers and on our website. And you can
We'll put a link to it on the show notes.
absolutely. But another part of the motivation for this is the apparent mental health crisis that's happening around the world, um, uh, especially accelerated by COVID isolation. Many people think that it's driven by a rising loneliness and the breakdown of social relationships. I have to say, I think there's a philosophical question here about how real mental health is, in the sense, at one end you have the kind of objectivist view that there's a real thing called depression, and you just need to know how to measure it correctly. And on the other end, there's this idea that people could be, that if we were able to compare our daily mood or our daily dysfunction to our ancestors, they may have had things a lot worse. They just didn't interpret it as worse, right? The comparative frame is important in the time. Where do you come out on that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion also about, over diagnosis and overuse. I think there's a lot of discussion overuse of mental health diagnosis. I know some of our colleagues in the psychology department, including our friend Lisa Cosgrove, have done work on that. So I find some of those arguments persuasive, namely that there might be a cultural piece of needing to find a diagnosis for everyday malaise. On the other hand, I think there are absolutely real brain-based, crisis-based diagnosis, probably fewer than people think they have. But for our own purposes, it almost doesn't matter. In the sense, the question that we kind of were fascinated by is, should you have a chatbot therapist? Is there any problem in having a chatbot therapist? So as you say, the background is there's a rising mental health crisis, either perceived or real, or partly perceived, partly real. There's a rising loneliness crisis, as you said, partly fueled by COVID and its aftermath. People like Jonathan Haidt would say, and I know that we disagree about him too, partly fueled, especially for teenage girls, by a crazy rise in social media use and phone addiction and social media addiction. And so there's a lot more demand for mental health services than there's supply. Uh, and then certainly then there's an affordable supply. So there's a bigger problem than there is human answers for. And that is in part because there's not enough therapists, and in part because in this country, at least, there's awful insurance coverage for mental health services. And into the breach, as usual, come our friends from Silicon Valley, and they're like, well, let's solve it because everything is a problem that requires a solution. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, the sort of solution-based mindset. And the solution is something that in one way or another has been around since the 80s, some kind of chatbot therapy that can supposedly take the place of a human therapist. So that was the general frame. So how do you, Jay, break down the questions there? So if the sort of provocative query is, should you use a chatbot therapist? What's your take?
Well, just to go back to the crisis part of it and the potential solutions. I started thinking about this during the Clinton healthcare reform debate 30 years ago, because I knew a guy who was on the committee of 500 who's working on that. And one of the things that the Clinton healthcare reform folks were looking at was whether to include mental health coverage in to mandate mental health coverage as a part of the Clinton healthcare reform. And they basically decided not to, in my memory, because it was going to be too expensive. If the estimation of making access to a round of therapy accessible to everyone who would want one would be impossible. And I think that's an important part of the picture, because as with many parts of automation debate, the question for me is not only can it do it better than the human, but if it can do it 100 times cheaper than the human and only 80% as good as humans, then maybe it's going to be doing a lot better than what we're doing now. So that's a part of my general perspective here, is that I believe that the ethical challenges or the practical challenges of implementing automation of any human service or need um, has to be looked at as a set of problems that could be solved. And eventually, I'm open to the possibility that automation can do things better, faster, cheaper than human beings. It may be only faster and cheaper right now, and not better, but that's where I'm coming from.
Right. So it's this kind of, in a way, policy approach that says that you are comparing a solution and not to an ideal, but to the actual alternative, which is fair. I think one of the questions that we will sort of end up with is a chatbot therapist better than no therapist at all, which certainly is the alternative part of the time here, and would most certainly be the alternative in parts of the developing world or in places where there's even less of a supply than there is here. But before we get there, maybe let's sort of lay out the kind of solutions that are on the table. So historically, I think some of us will remember there's the ELIZA program, which was, I think, developed in MIT, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not 100% sure where it was
I
developed.
think maybe it was in California, but
Yeah,
yeah, Weizenbaum's experiment with having just a simple algorithm that was able to, through text interface, it had Rogerian responses. The Rogerian therapy is basically, I hear you saying X. You're just repeating back to the patient what they're saying.
right.
And back in the 80s, but no, it was earlier than that. It was in the 70s when that was designed. That turned out to be so popular with the people who got access to it that Weizenbaum himself freaked out and thought that this was going to be a terrible idea. I agree. I mean, it wasn't doing very much. Doesn't seem to have done very much harm either. But yeah, ever
Yeah.
since then, there's been this kind of research in that area.
Yeah, and part, I'm sure one thing that we'll also keep coming back to, it's an interesting question why it had that kind of success. And you could say it had that kind of success because there was an unmet need, and people even then were feeling so lonely and so in need of some kind of exchange that this fill that hole. The other explanation that I tend to find more persuasive and applicable to some of the other contexts that we'll talk about is, people tend to anthropomorphize technology, to project human qualities onto technology really, really easily. Just like we name our cars and we name our boats, it is very easy for us to see human features where they don't exist and to kind of complete that picture. But fast forwarding from ELIZA, the introduction of chatbots and generative AI in the last few years has created a real opening here. And a bunch of companies have said, well, maybe for starters, let's try to automate some of the assistive functions around therapy. So let's try to automate the intake process where the therapist kind of interviews the patient about their history and kind of gets the initial basic information. Let's try to automate the scheduling process where that anyone who's been to therapy knows that that can be actually somewhat difficult and fraught. Let's try to automate maybe a kind of follow-up between meetings of the therapist and the patient to say if there's some kind of therapy plan, if there's some kind of, exercises that you have to perform, if there's some kind of medication that you need to take. Let's try to use a chatbot to communicate with the patient between meetings and remind them or make sure that they're on track. So all of those are sort of, you could say, broadly administrative assistant, even sophisticated administrative assistant type functions. And then on the more ambitious part of the scale, some companies have tried to replace therapy itself, have tried to use the chatbot technology instead of the actual therapy session. So I'm curious where you are on that distinction, or whether you think that there's a difference between those different roles.
Well, absolutely. In the paper, of course, we broke out, starting from presumably the least controversial applications to the more controversial ones. The use of chatbot patients for teaching therapists, for instance, I don't think very many people would have a big problem with that. Although it does raise some of the same questions of whether the training that a therapist would get from simulated patients is going to be as good as the training that you get from actual interactions. But rounding up actual people to practice therapy on is as difficult as rounding up an actual therapist to talk to. So it would be a lot easier. I can imagine that you could get a lot farther, a lot cheaper, training therapists with simulated patients.
So I just didn't mention that. So just to clarify, this is kind of like a flight simulator for therapists, where
Right,
you'd have the chatbot simulate a patient in order to train the therapist.
right. And
Right.
there's already lots of use cases out there and evidence. I mean, I think a lot of the problem that we often face in this domain is that the people who are developing these things aren't putting them through rigorous quality controls and testing. And so we see a lot of hype on the part of the developers and a lot of uninformed, often complaints about how terrible such an idea is, with very little kind of communication between the critics and the hypesters. So this is what I see as part of our role. But there's definitely a lot of applications out there for chatbot patient training. Um, there's also a lot of work on, I think that the field of affective computing. And if you remember when the ChatGPT released its voice, or demonstrated its voice model 6 months ago now, it was the scandal with Scarlett Johansson's voice, whether they used it or not. That voice had emotion in it that was startling to people, right? It was emotionally sophisticated. It appeared to be able to communicate in an emotionally sophisticated way that people found startling. And as a consequence, it hasn't even been released yet because people are so worried about the consequences of that. But then on the other side, there's been research for decades on trying to get computers to recognize emotions in people through facial gestures and voice and so forth. That's coming along, and that's now being integrated into these systems. So, in terms of having a communicative partner, it raises both the efficacy and the dilemma, the philosophical zombie dilemma that we'll get to, that it sounds like you're talking to a real person. I think that's great, and it will conversely be able to recognize from your voice whether you're in distress or not, or other kinds of issues about your therapy. So I think that evidence has accumulated that we're able to do that, and that it's coming along.
Yeah. By
Really.
the way, just adding to a conversation from a little bit earlier about diagnoses, um, as you say, the potential of the technologies to use text analysis, voice analysis, potentially fluctuations in everything from pulse to heart rate, et cetera, does have a promise of more accuracy in potential diagnoses than human diagnoses. So there's some real promise there, assuming that the guardrails are there, that the data used is accurate, et cetera, et cetera. To me, it seems like one of the key distinctions, we talk about this in the paper too. By the way, the link to the paper will be in the show notes. It's not a purely academic paper, it's a white paper, which means it's supposed to be accessible to non-specialists too. But it seems like one of the key distinctions is if you're using chatbots as a therapist's helper or in therapist training, as long as they're trained on the right data, as long as you watch questions of privacy, as long as they're not hallucinating, that seems to be pretty promising. I think where you and I are probably going to somewhat diverge is, or a lot diverge, is what about using them as actual therapists? So let's assume, for the sake of conversation, that the chatbots that are used as actual therapists, they don't hallucinate, so they're not full of shit. They're trained on the right data. You found data sets of actual therapy transcripts to make them good, all of which are, serious challenges. There's some kind of human quality control behind it. They use the best models. By the way, all of this is expensive. Startups that are developing these products almost by necessity are going to be cutting costs. Whether or not they'll be wanting to pay that kind of money to make sure that their chatbot therapists are reliable is a different question. But let's assume that that's solved. Where are you on actual chatbot therapists? Not for adjunctive purposes, not for assistive purposes, not for scheduling, not for training, not for follow-up, but replacing actual therapy.
Well, as we say in the paper, we have to keep a very close eye on making sure that these are actually doing what we think that they're doing, that they're not generating more problems. But I think that we're close to being able to have most of the same results that we expect from human therapeutic relationships from these systems. We mentioned in the paper, Google has a new articulate medical intelligence explorer that's a chatbot trained for diagnostic dialogue. It takes histories, it provides diagnoses, it counsels patients, and it manages their therapies across multiple conditions. One of the things that's always made me optimistic in this field, and by the way, my doctoral dissertation was on the feasibility of replacing doctors with nurses and AI back in the 90s. And back then, one of the appeals was, look, medicine is so complicated these days. If you look at how doctors are practicing compared to the latest medical knowledge that's being generated, they're usually at least 15 years behind. They're usually still practicing off of what they learned in medical school. And they can't possibly keep in their head all of the conditions, especially for older patients who may have 6 or 7 things going on. They can't keep it all in their head. They can't know all the drug interaction literature about the drugs that they're prescribing. And so back in the 90s, pharmacists began to use AI that would alert them to the fact, well, if you give them this, you shouldn't give them this, because the pharmacists couldn't keep that in their head. I think one of the things that we're going to see is that a chatbot therapist that can keep every single fact it's learned about you in its memory and know from big data that which facts are relevant to predicting suicidality or depression or different what your specific medical condition is, that those are going to be a lot more efficacious than imperfect humans. Now, one of the ways to do this is just to say, well, there always has to be a human in the loop. There always has to be a therapist, a human therapist someplace, monitoring what's going on, making sure it doesn't go awry. And then we talk in the paper about that kind of an arrangement where you don't use it as a replacement, but you use it as an intermediary, the 24/7 thing that you can go to between your weekly visits or your biweekly visits. And I think that's probably where we'll land in the short term until it's really well demonstrated. You agree with that?
Practically speaking, yes, I do agree with that. I think it's going to be hard to resist the trajectory of this once. I'm always willing to assume that the technology, which is a big assumption, but for philosophical clarity, I'm always happy to assume that the technology will deliver on everything that it promises, and then ask, is there something still left to worry about, even if this turns out to be safe and smart and great at diagnoses and actually maybe practically indistinguishable from a human conversation. So I think you're right. In the short and medium term, it will probably be mainly in a sort of therapist assistant capacity that these things will be used. And I think that there's actually real promise there. Where I do think this is going, and maybe this is true about countries that have special challenges in access to human therapists, is to use chatbots as the actual therapist. And there, I think there's at least two questions or two distinctions that I want to suggest. One is, you know, so one popular modality of psychotherapy is cognitive behavioral therapy. Broadly speaking, you know, focused and emphasizing either practical advice or tools for learning how there can be distortions in the way that we think. And in some basic way, I think here technology is more appropriate. There's already apps that kind of give that kind of practical advice. The other modality of therapy is psychodynamic therapy, and that's much more based on relationships and open-ended conversations and long-term conversations, and it's inspired by the Freudian model, which takes the patient's psychological and family history seriously with a chatbot. And well,
Can we just
let
pause
me
at the
ask you.
CB? Let's just pause at the CBT psychotherapy thing because I just have to confess that I've always my reading of the literature is that there's not that much evidence that psychotherapy is actually efficacious, at least in comparison to these shorter term, more operationalized kinds of therapies like CBT. But you whether it's efficacious or not, do you have personal experience, or what leads you to think that psychotherapy is actually something that we want everyone to have access to?
We don't want everyone to have access to, uh, but it certainly helps plenty of people. I mean, I think the research on efficacy is usually short term.
Yeah.
So CBT research is done broadly with psychology undergraduate students for the periods of, probably 3 to 6 months. And it's probably true that it's easier to demonstrate its efficacy in 3 to 6 months compared to, psychodynamic therapy, which is relationship based. But most relationships have not sort of come into their own in 3 to 6 months. So, I guess I'm more skeptical of the efficacy kind of research. What I'm fascinated about with this kind of question is that it's an example of a broader issue, namely, can you have a relationship with a robot? Can you have a relationship with a chatbot? Does it matter if you think you're having a relationship with a chatbot? So, I mean, look, broadly speaking, most therapists talk about something called a therapeutic alliance when it comes to at least psychodynamic therapy. And this is this notion that there's a partnership between the therapist and the patient, and that they decide together on the goals of therapy, and that they want the best for each other, broadly speaking, and that there's a degree of mutual recognition and a degree of empathy that's involved there, and that they're partners in the project of getting the patient to feel better. And one question that we asked is, can you have a therapeutic alliance with a chatbot? My answer to that is no, because it can sound like it has empathy for you. It can sound like it wants the best for you. It can sound like it cares about you, but it doesn't. There's no for now, as far as we know, there's no ghost in the machine. And I guess where this goes to in some basic way is you can say, well, this is a bunch of upper middle class worries because
Exactly.
a lot of people can't afford it. And if Joe says, or if Nancy says, like a lot of Joes and Nancys, by the way, do say, I've never had somebody care about me as much as this chatbot has. I feel that this chatbot likes me more than my therapist liked me. I feel that this chatbot likes me more than my family liked me. I feel I have a relationship with it. So don't tell me otherwise. What do you think about Joe and Nancy's
Well,
disposition?
not to cast aspersions on any human service profession, but I think one of the big problems in human service professions is that professionals who actually do care about their patients or clients, that can be a problem too, right? It can be a problem for their burnout. It's not necessarily a great idea for them to be overly emotionally involved with their patients. So I think every time someone says, well, the humans do this and the robots do this, it's like, really, do the humans really do that? So and how much do we really know about our therapist, right? Do we just the fact that they're human, is that all that we need to know about the other person on the other line? The whole idea in psychodynamic or psychotherapeutic theory about transference and countertransference and all that, that seems like a whole bunch of unnecessary stuff that human beings are adding into this relationship that just gets in the way of the actual therapeutic benefit. I'm sure there are arguments for why it's better to have that, um, but another aspect of this, shame. I'm a social scientist, and people have been looking at what kinds of disclosures people are willing to make in different contexts. I started with sex survey research when I was a graduate student, and it was clear immediately that having a human ask you if you did X, Y, or Z was going to get less out of folks than having them fill it out on a computer, because there's less shame involved, and there's a lot of shameful things that you need to disclose during a therapeutic relationship where so I think that we really need to take a step back in every one of these discussions and say, well, we think this is what's important about the human here, but are we just, black boxing human and not taking apart the things that humans are actually supposed to be doing, and maybe they don't actually, or maybe they aren't actually that important. So yeah, I'm suspicious about this. We talk in the paper about parasocial relationships. That was what, for me, that was one of the kind of realizations, is that a parasocial relationship, which there's a lot of discussion of this these days, and I started to think about it because of my kids' involvement with, or my daughter's involvement with the BTS fandom, the Korean boy band. And the BTS fandom is constantly about affirmations of positive affirmations about them, about their fans, to their fans, that you should be confident, that you should live your best life. And they're completely parasocial in the sense that you have this apparent very intimate relationship, seeing them 24/7 in the various social media things that they're releasing. So people think that they have this relationship, and that can lead to pathology. People who can become overly involved in this relationship. But at the same time, the research tends to suggest that for most fans, it's a positive thing to have this fake relationship with these boy band and on the other side of the planet. In the same way, I think people can get therapeutic relationships out of these artificial relationships. And that, yes, there are people who take it in a pathological direction, but are the pathologies of these artificial relationships really that different from the pathologies in human relationships? I mean, I know people who've been sexually and emotionally abused by their therapists. So this is not it's not a fake issue.
Oh, no, it's certainly not a fake issue, but the fact that actual relationships are subject to abuse isn't yet an argument for replacing them with fake ones. It's an argument for being careful about the real ones.
Yeah.
Look, I would say something like this. Going back to our old friend Aristotle, he makes a really interesting point about happiness, which is you can think you're happy and be wrong about it. You can sort of define your well-being, he says, in terms of, bodily pleasures and say, I'm sitting on the beach in Aruba with my margaritas and I'm really, really happy. This is what it is. Or you could define your happiness in terms of, well, I won the Pulitzer Prize or I won the Nobel Prize, and now that I've won them and I've gotten all the honors I want, I'm really happy. And he says you would think that, but you would be wrong. You'd be wrong because that's not what human happiness consists in. And we don't have to get deeply into Aristotle here because it's not our topic. But the interesting insight is happiness could be an objective thing that people can be wrong about. And that's a harder pill to swallow here, with 21st century personalized perceptions of happiness, but it's an interesting argument. So my sort of pushback about your parasocial relationship argument is, well, what if there's an analogy to relationships here? Namely, you can think you're having a relationship. You can think that this thing is as nice to you as your family. You can think that you're getting as much from it as you get from your flawed actual relationships where people don't talk to you and people are occasionally abusive, but you would be wrong. That there's an objective set of criteria for what it is to have a relationship, and you should train people. I mean, like the point you made about the shame in those surveys. The solution to that is not necessarily to give more people more computers to do more surveys more anonymously so that they don't have to feel shame, but to teach them how to deal with shame, and that sometimes we can be ashamed of the wrong things, and that teaching them to do that has to involve humans. And similarly with transference, that the idea is not to get rid of it by means of a chatbot or to emulate it by means of a chatbot, but to work through it with transference and countertransference with an actual human. So, I mean, to be the question is, can you think you have a relationship with a chatbot therapist and be totally wrong about that?
Yes, in the same way that you can think you have a faithful relationship with a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend and be totally wrong about that. I think your question about the authenticity of happiness gets back to our original starting point about whether we really have a mental health crisis or not, what it means to be happy and authentically happy. Um,
Yeah.
I'm more on the eudaimonic end of that than hedonic, but most of mental health is about the hedonic in the sense of your daily mood, rather than improving your evaluation of whether your life overall is heading in the right direction. But whichever end of that you end up on, let's just go back to the therapeutic relationship in the sense that if there's no consensus in the field of psychotherapy about psychotherapeutic modalities and techniques, and you're basically shopping around to find the one who performs for you the kind of therapy that you think is making you happy. That seems to be opposite to your point that you're actually engaging in deep work with someone who has a very good understanding of what should really be making you happy. What you're really doing is shopping around, and perhaps this is equally true for the robots, but shopping around for the thing that seems to satisfy you in the moment. That's, I think, a problem to begin with in the therapeutic relationship, that we don't have any objective standard about what therapy is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I guess in partial response, I'd say, well, one necessary condition for it to do anything at all, at least in my book, would be that it involves a real human relationship. Whether it's with a CBT therapist or whether it's with a psychodynamic therapist, you need to be able to somehow like them, trust them, think that they want the best for you. And if you can't reach that conclusion, it's not going to work no matter the modality. And you can only reach that conclusion vis-a-vis an actual human being. Although half of the time it'll fail, like you say, because a lot of people are shitty. But when it won't is where the magic happens, and I think it can't happen with robots in some basic way, even if people think that it does. I mean, this goes to another sort of Aristotelian point, namely, which is if we acquire most of our characteristics and dispositions and what he calls virtues by training, by action, by habit, by, if you become sort of generous by putting yourself in situations where, uh, how to figure out your disposition about money and giving are regularly required. And if you become courageous by putting yourself in danger and figuring out with a good role model what a more courageous person would do, there's something worrying to me about more and more interactions with fake entities, what kind of relationship abilities that's training us into.
See, you're the most important text for me getting interested in bioethics was "What Sort of People Should There Be" by Jonathan Glover. And what he does in that very short book that everyone should read is he says, okay, here's a problem like the metaverse, and here's what people complain about it. Well, we could fix that problem, and then the next problem we could fix, and then the next problem we can fix. And is there anything left after we fix the problem? What I tried to do with you in this paper is say, okay, we show that it can do scheduling better. We show that it can do diagnosis better. We show that it can do emotional recognition better. We show that it can put all that together into a therapeutic relationship that people seem to be happy with. And you say, yeah, but it's still not human. And I'm like, dude, what's left? Well,
Well,
why do you still think it's not working just because
whoa,
it's
whoa,
not
whoa.
human?
You gave up my entire farm.
Yeah.
I agree that it could probably do scheduling better. It could probably do intake better. It could probably do follow up and scheduling better. What it can't do better is what we're doing right now, having an actual conversation. I'm not having an actual relationship that is funny, moving, et cetera, et cetera. That I'm not convinced of yet. And I think,
You're not
and this is,
convinced. You're not convinced, but you acknowledge that it's an open question whether we could get there, right?
well, I don't know. I
Okay,
think it
yes, you
by
do.
that,
Yeah.
so here I have to be dogmatic because I think by definition a robot can have a relationship with you. You can think it has a relationship with you, but you would be wrong. I think you can be wrong about having a relationship. I think you can be wrong about having about being happy. I think you can be wrong about whether somebody's a good person. You know, might think that somebody who like is an ass kisser and will compliment you all day. Many of us would think, "Oh, that's a great person," because we like flattery so much. We would objectively be wrong. That person is a jerk trying to get somewhere or has some other kind of pathology. I mean, look, this goes into part of why we were fascinated by this is just a case study of the broader question of AI relationships, which
Yeah.
is upon us. Stuff like the movie Her is pretty much like you were saying with the Scarlett Johansson voice on ChatGPT is pretty much a relationship tomorrow. As you know, we've been talking to some high school kids. A lot of them are increasingly having AI friends.
Yeah.
A lot of people are, increasingly dating, as it were, and people can't see my air quotes because this is audio, dating chatbots. Is there anything fundamentally wrong with that? I remember there's this Ezra Klein podcast from last year, if I'm remembering correctly, where he said tomorrow's question won't be if your kids have chatbot friends, but how many of your kids' friends are chatbots. Descriptively, that's probably true, but the question is, are chatbot friends really friends? Are those real relationships? So it's just a variation of the therapy question, which we decided to focus on. And I guess between us, like you raise it really well. Am I open to the idea that a relationship with a chatbot can ever be a relationship? I guess my answer is no.
What about machine subjectivity? Because we're not there yet. I don't know how quickly we're going to get there. I believe we eventually will get there. Having machines that are subjectively conscious, self-aware, have intents and purposes of their own, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that that will ever happen?
Well, I guess we first have to figure out human subjectivity, but yeah, I think if there's a way, which I doubt there will be, if there's a way to sort of establish spontaneous consciousness for non-human entities like chatbots, then we can reopen the discussion. But that's still science fiction.
Yeah, for the
Uh,
time being, at least. Well, I mean, yes, the philosophical zombie question. I think that's the territory we're in. People likely to attribute over anthropomorphize relationships with machines in ways that most people find troubling. But I think most of those problems can be fixed. And I think your example about kids growing up with multiple chatbot friends, I think they're going to quickly discover. I think we will all quickly discover using a chatbot girlfriend, the difference between having a chatbot boyfriend or girlfriend and having an actual boyfriend or girlfriend. Now, some people will prefer the chatbot boyfriend or girlfriend for a variety of reasons, and I presume that most of us will still understand the difference there, and that we're not going to expect them to come and make dinner for us or whatever.
But if they, I mean, but I guess what I'm trying to press on you is if they prefer the chatbot girlfriend and boyfriend, they would be wrong, and that their parents and their teachers and their professors and their priests or whatever should convince them that they're wrong. This is not a personal preference kind of question. No matter how good the chatbots get, until perhaps that distant future that you just asked about, they have some kind of subjective experience, and then we can talk about it again.
Is it wrong to appreciate electronic music versus live performance by human musicians?
Yeah, but you don't have a relationship with electronic music.
I think a lot of us have relationships with the musicians that we like, and we put value in them.
That's relationship as a metaphor. That's not an actual relationship.
Well, this gets back to the therapeutic relationship. How real is my relationship with someone I'm paying to talk to me for 1 hour a week? I can impute all kinds of things to that relationship that are completely fictitious.
It could be real. It has the potential of being real because there's a human being there with the potential to wish you well and to recognize changes in you and to create a partnership with you. I mean, why not ask how real is your relationship with your wife and how real is your relationship with your kids? I mean, all of those have interests built into them.
I think, as we begin to interrogate the differences between electronic relationships with machines and human relationships, we will begin to tease apart how deep and real our relationships with other human beings are. And that probably will be very useful because as I think about this, I mean, how much do you really need to know about someone? It doesn't make a difference that they're cheating on you behind your back if you still are getting what you want out of a relationship. How much do you need to know about them? How real does the things that you need to know about them? I think those are all very important questions, and they're coming out of this discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, philosophically, where this goes to, and it's something that, you and I don't agree on, is, how much does this idea of the real have content?
Right.
And how much does it matter? And to sort of buttress your point from earlier, I mean, I think part of the way this develops in interesting fashion is that not only are we going to have chatbots that can sound like human beings, but if you combine that with, robotics, if you combine that with something like the Amica robot that's being developed in Great Britain, then you have something using ChatGPT or Claude or Anthropic or Gemini, I'm sorry, to talk, but then it has facial expressions kind of like you and I have, and it can be embodied. And pretty soon you are not yet, but pretty soon you're in the sort of dark mirror territory of an episode like Be Right Back, right? Where if you remember that episode where the sort of the woman is mourning the passing of her partner, and then she gets a grief chatbot to talk to. Already have those actually, right? She gets a grief chatbot based on his social media to talk to, and it sounds just like him. And then she gets a sort of robot that his features and qualities can be projected onto, and you have the whole embodied experience. I mean, the dude ends up in the attic because he's unsatisfying in a bunch of ways, but that's less science fiction, let's say, than it used to be, 5-7 years ago when that episode was made.
30 years ago when my mother died, I set up a webpage to commemorate her. I had I didn't have video or audio, but people were putting video and audio in mausoleums so that people could hear and see the person who had died. And I don't think anyone freaked out about it, right? Because it's not like, oh, how damaging to the people's psyche. They're never going to move on again if they can still see the video and audio. I think grief bots, this is a fake made up problem. We're going to create these interactive versions of the dead, and people will chat with them for a little while, and then they'll get bored and they'll turn them off.
Depends how good they are and how much you like the person. I could totally see this being not a fake problem where you make somebody stuck in the cycle of grief forever because they can't move on.
Well, should people burn all the pictures and videos of their
No,
dead
but you
ones?
can't talk to pictures.
But you can
If
sit
you're
and
heavy, if
you
you're
can sit and mourn over anything of the person. The blanket that they used, you could sit and hold it for the rest of your life because you're so sad that they died. I mean,
Yeah,
this
but
idea
it's boring to talk to a blanket. It's not boring to talk to a chat. I mean, if the chatbot is trained, and if you're a heavy social media user, which neither of us is a super heavy social media user, if you're like a super heavy social media user and you have a shitload of video and audio online, and the models are good enough and potentially self-correcting and self-expanding based on synthetic data and so on and so on and so forth, you could have a creative, ebullient, interesting JBot who you could talk to forever. I mean, I hope you don't die. If you die, I'll miss you. I want to talk to your chatbot. There's something to be said for the finality.
Well, just on that topic, I think one of the things we're going to be talking about pretty quickly is digital twins and AI agents who are based on you. Something that can capitalize, you plug in the Google Gemini, it reads all of your Gmails, it monitors all your Zoom calls, it looks at every document in your life, and can do a reasonable simulacrum of you for certain purposes, digital twinning. And as we get used to digital twinning, we'll be interacting with other people's digital twins, right? And so there'll be this kind of digital intermediary that we accept as a way to communicate with this other person. That will probably change this conversation profoundly.
So, sir, what do you think? Should we move on to our?
I think we've given people a taste of where the issues were in that paper, ethics of automating therapy, and again, the link is in the show notes. You want to do a couple quick news item roundups?
Yeah, so we thought we'd have a feature in the show of a quick coverage, quick discussion of interesting stuff that popped up in the news the week before. So, what did you want to talk about, Jay?
Well, if we can start getting political, you used the word ebullient. I said that I'm ebullient since the recent change in American politics, but we can punt on talking about politics this week. But a politics adjacent topic is algocracy, or the use of algorithms to replace human decision making and human governance in various ways. So there was a recent fascinating paper from UK and German researchers. They did experiments with 200 folks, and they asked them first, do you want an AI to make a distributional decision about your income versus other human beings? And the majority of them chose AI, had the intuition that AI would be fairer than other human beings. So then they had AI make some distributional decisions on various criteria, and they gave them back to everyone. And the majority of the people were dissatisfied with the AI made decisions about distribution compared to the humans ones and the rationales for those distributional decisions. I think this is a one shot kind of thing, right? That you could have made, the AI could have made different distributional decisions that were closer to human intuitions. Um, and over time, we won't use systems that we are dissatisfied with the consequences that come out of them. But the initial result, the initial ask, would you trust AI decisions about distributing income in society? I think people have an interesting intuition there that eventually we'll be able to get algorithms that do it better. What's your thought?
Yeah, no, it is. That difference there is fascinating. So people before the distribution is made think that the AI might be able to do it better. That's both a vote of confidence in the potential of the algorithms to make the decision, and it's a vote of non-confidence in how humans are have been actually making it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be open to it. And then probably what's going on, at least part of what's going on with their dissatisfaction after the decision is made, is a kind of selfishness bias ex post facto that, as John Locke says famously, we're shitty judges in our own case most of the time. This is obviously not just a theoretically interesting experiment because AIs are actually already making distributional decisions, everything from loan eligibility to police force allocation to um, hiring and firing in certain school districts, et cetera, et cetera. So there is already a lot of algorithmic decision making going on. And it's fascinating to see that people are not necessarily mistrustful of it. It echoes the conversation that we had earlier in some ways. What if these AI judgments turn out to be safer and more fair and more equitable than the human ones? So what if the I mean, it's possible theoretically for sure to get rid of algorithmic bias. That's a question of, commercial and political motivation and good data and good models, right?
Right.
Um,
I mean, we've
so
had the redlining. You mentioned loans. We've had the redlining discussion since what, the 50s,
yeah,
and we didn't have algorithms back then. We just had
right,
rudimentary statistics about
right,
loan eligibility,
yeah,
plus the racism and the classism and the everything else that was going into those
yeah.
decisions. So I think there's a kind of a false binary here about algorithms making decisions versus humans. The algorithms that are going to be making decisions will be the result of human design and human decision making about what kind of algorithm you should use,
And
and
in what
those will
context
just,
you should use it.
yeah, and where you should use it. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm a big believer that algocracy is happening apace, and is basically the crystallization of human decision making.
Yeah, and you could see this, and I know we've talked about that. I mean, you could see this in much more humdrum everyday context, like local government deciding what streets in a smaller town are going to be repaved first based on, algorithmic decision making. And I could totally see the results of this experiment replicated where people might think this is a good idea or possibly a good idea in practice because they'll think, oh, this is going to be objective and efficient. And then when their neighbor's street gets repaved before theirs, they'll be pissed.
Right.
Think that it's unfair.
Yeah, just on the political point, if gerrymandering could be fixed, I think the best way to fix it is algorithmically determined. We agree on what the algorithm should be to create a district boundary and just go with that, right?
Yeah,
And
you
different
can be
algorithms.
sure that the algorithms will be kept away from the gerrymandering decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the people who are trying to gerrymander are using their own algorithms. That's the problem. Okay, so the second the one that we could look at is AI adds to workload. This is from an article in PC Mag and from a firm called Upwork that surveyed, I think, 2,500 workers in the US, UK, Australia, and Canada, and a bunch of executives at firms. And it asked the executives, do you expect AI to be increasing worker productivity? Almost 100% said yes. And then they said, well, are you training your workers on how to do productivity? And only a quarter were. And then let's see, then they asked the workers and they said, how do you think it's impacting your productivity? And the majority of them said it's just adding work, if anything. I don't know how to use it. And so there's a lot of skepticism. You think this is, personally, I think this is a time limited thing with every technology. There's hype, there's a hype cycle about a technology. There's a wide adoption before the evidence and the implementation is really there yet. Then people start to figure it out. And this has been part of the productivity paradox debate that's been going on since the 70s, that we've had all this computerization. We don't seem to have improvements in productivity commensurate with it. So what do you think's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, so the distinction is between the employer's expectations of increased productivity and the employee's report of decreased productivity. I mean, part of it, I think, is that the employers are subject to the hype and they're like, well, I just paid for all of these AI subscriptions across the enterprise. And everybody keeps talking about AI, and you can't, talk about your product if you don't talk about AI, so it must be doing something great. And so I think the employers are to some extent influenced by the hype cycle. I think the other part of it is potentially people in executive roles are not actually on the regular front line of using the tools as much, and they don't know what they can and can't do. I think on the employee side, part of what's going on is you've added to my work expectations to learn this tool. That's taking some time. And as I'm learning this tool, some things it's okay for, some things it's just shitty at. But now I can't tell you, A, I need more time from you and more patience from you, boss, because I need the time to learn the tool. And B, here's the things it's shitty at. Here's the things it's plausible at. Here's the very small minority of things right now that it exceeds me at. That's a complicated explanation. So I think in some ways that's a traditional sort of information gap between employers and employees. What's your sense?
I think I agree with you. I think a lot of the problems in the workplace are. Let me take a step back. I'm very interested in the debate of uh, automation of work in general. And back more than a decade ago, there was this paper from Oxford that suggested that half of all jobs could be automated away in some period of time. The Frey and Osborne paper. And then a lot of the research since then has suggested, well, there's particular tasks in any job that might be amenable to automation, but then there are other tasks of that job that will expand to fill the time. So not only are we trying to use chatbots for the communication or text analysis or whatever tasks that are part of our job, but there's a lot of other things that in our job that we're still expected to do that we can't automate yet. So I think it's early days, and we'll see how much of the job can be automated. But if you look at ChatGPT's plans for releasing future models and how they're going to rank them, the next phase of what they're trying to do is to get chatbots that have agentic features, which means you can tell it, monitor the space for these particular products and alert me and or just buy them when they reach a certain price point or whatever. The kind of automation that's already happening in the stock market, for instance, stock buying automation. So
Yeah.
that kind of agentic automation will probably be a lot more dramatic impact in the workplace than simply having a chatbot.
Well, I think there's one more thing going on, and that is straightforward resistance to change from employees. And we might think about like people get grumpy with a change to their routine being introduced. And I think it's actually an interesting discussion to be had about the value of that grumpiness. I mean, as you know, I value grumpiness dearly. But so, for example, as a college teacher, all of a sudden 2 years ago, I was told, you have to revamp and revise your entire system of assessing students because ChatGPT just came online and they'll be writing their papers themselves. And part of me was sort of shit, I don't want to do that, and I don't want to figure out what to do instead, in part because I was too lazy to do it, in part because I was too rigid to do it. But part of me, I think, was grumpy for a good reason. I mean, this may be pure rationalization, but you tell me what you think. Part of me was saying, this is brand new. I don't know what its value is yet, just because, a couple of the masters of the universe in Silicon Valley came up with this nonsense, does it mean that I immediately have to, change the way I'm doing things? Who said that this is a good innovation? Who said that this is a valuable innovation? Why were universities, for example, which they were and they are, why were they pushing this line of this is here, you can't resist it, you can't push back against it, might as well, it's the sort of old weird kind of submissive surrender to technology argument. It's not going anywhere, might as well find a way to live with it. And I was saying, no, rage against the dying of the light. So I think there's part of that going on as well, the kind of grumpiness and resistance to change, some of which is just rigidity, some of which is, can be justified.
When I first got to UMass Boston, there were people, we adopted at UMass Boston PeopleSoft back in 2005, but there were people who've been employed there forever before that. And I've met people who had been resisting PeopleSoft ever since, right? Had refused to use that new tool, PeopleSoft.
That would be me since 1982, right?
Okay. Well, this is going to be fun. We're going to do this every 2 weeks?
Every second week.
Okay.
The grump and the optimist face off.
Yes, on prosthetic gods. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today, listeners.
Thank you. See you soon.